And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the clouds and lands divine shine forth upon our crowded hills? And was the Jerusalem building here among these concerts
This Sunday, we celebrate St. George, and as you know, who's the patron saint of England. And his cross forms part of our national flag. That's the Red Cross. Now, we're all very aware of the images of George riding his white horse and slaying the dragon. But other images are well known too, and he's often seen with a fellow knight, Saint Demetrius, who was another early soldier saint. Now, it's thought these two represent the earthly manifestations of the archangels Michael and Gabriel. But who was George? Well, for a start off, he was not English. He was born in Turkey in the 3rd century. And as we know, he's always depicted as a knight, but it's thought that he was actually a Roman officer, an officer in the Roman army. He was martyred because he died for his faith in Palestine around AD 303. The then Roman Emperor Diocletian had him executed by decapitation because George refused to make a sacrifice in honour of the pagan gods. So the poor man lost his head. Now, St. George was canonised in AD 494 because, it is said, he was one of whose names are fully revered among men, but whose acts are known only to God. And no, he never visited England. But his reputation became popular with the English kings of the medieval times. And we had Edward I, who on his banners he displayed the emblem of St. George. And then, of course, we had Edward III, who was alleged to have such a strong interest in George that he actually carried around a relic of his blood. But the feast day of St. George came about after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And since then, certainly in the Middle Ages, it was a very important feast in the English calendar. Now, in the Middle Ages, people believed St. George was one of the 14 holy helpers. In other words, he was part of the group of saints who would help in times of epidemics, and at that time, namely leprosy and, of course, the plague. But the actual St. George cross was not used to represent England until Henry VIII, until the reign of Henry VIII. Now, from around 1100, St. George was thought to protect the British Army, and has done ever since. And all of you who love Shakespeare, namely Henry V, and his battle cry at the Battle of Harfleur. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, crying, God for Harry, England, and St. George. And 500 years later, during the First World War, it was alleged an apparition of St. George is said to have helped the British troops during their retreat from Mons. And the Navy was involved too, because a naval commander of the Zeebrugge raid cited St. George as an inspiration to the men involved. And on that note, we all know that St. George represents those we honour, namely the Order of the Garter, which is the highest order of chivalry in this country. And St. George's cross appears on the Garter badge and is image independent of the chain, of the Garter chain. And of course, as we talk about war and honour, in 1940, the then King George VI created a new award for acts of greatest heroism or courage in circumstances of extreme danger. And of course we know that as the George Cross. Of course it was named after the king, but it still bears the image of St. George vanquishing the dragon. And of course some of you will be thinking, the dragon, now where does that come in? Well, that story and the dragon, George and the dragon, comes from a story that was put about several centuries after the real George had died. And that story, this is what the story says, that George rode into Cyrene, which is in modern-day Libya, to free the city from a dragon that had a taste for humans. And of course, the image of George slaying the dragon has survived since. But as I say, these images became popular, they were popularised in the 9th century, which was some 500 years after his death. Now, I think how it came about, George and the Dragon, because originally it was viewed as a simple representation of the battle between good and evil. And of course, the story was developed and popularised in the Middle Ages. Now, George is not just all about England. We do share him with other countries, namely Italy, Venice and Genoa, and Portugal, Ethiopia and Colonica. But St. George is honoured by Anglicans, Catholics, Orthodox Christians and Muslims throughout the world. He's referred to as the great martyr by the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria refer George as the Prince of Martyrs. And of course the Catholic Church in India venerates George. Here, the Church of England, in the Church of England, we celebrate St. George on the 23rd of April each year. And of course, it's become more and more popular. We see on our public buildings the George Cross flying, and naturally, ancient and historic tradition is to fly the plain St. George's Cross from Church of England churches. And we see with our football, with the advent of television, we see this flag flying more and more. So, happy St. George's Day. God bless.